Hey everyone. Today we're going to break down a series of claims about the 2020 election in Fulton County, Georgia that you may have seen online. We're going to walk through the arguments step by step, starting with what the sources call a key admission, and then following the logic all the way to their final conclusion. So let's dive right in.
You know, everything we're about to discuss really comes back to this one single question. The case presented in the source material isn't so much about if a rule was broken, but more about what the consequences should be when it is. This is the frame we need to keep in mind as we go through their argument.
All right, so where does this whole story start? Well, according to the sources we're looking at, it all kicks off with one specific moment, a statement made during a Georgia state election board hearing. They frame this as the catalyst for this entire debate. And here it is. This is the quote that everything else is built on. The sources call it a bombshell admission. You have a Fulton County attorney right there in front of the board saying, and I'm quoting, "We do not dispute that the tapes were not signed. It was a violation of the rule." For the people making this case, this is ground zero. Okay, so you hear that and you might think, a rule was violated, so what? To really get why the sources see this as such a huge deal, we've got to understand what they're actually talking about. What even are these tabulation tapes that the attorney mentioned? The easiest way to think about a tabulation tape is like an official receipt from a voting machine. The sources explain that under Georgia law, this tape gets printed out when the polls close to show the final score, the final vote count. But here's the part that's absolutely crucial to their argument. They say that poll workers are legally required to sign it. That signature is what makes it official, what certifies the count. So the way the sources describe it, this whole process is meant to create a clear paper trail, right? From the beginning of the day to the very end. It starts in the morning with what's called a zero tape that's signed to prove, hey, this machine is starting at zero. Then all day people vote. And finally, at the end of the day, a final tape is printed out, and this is the key, it's signed by the poll workers to lock in those final numbers. Without those signatures, they argue, there's no official legal certification. Okay, so we have an admission that a rule was broken. The next question is, how big of a deal was it? The sources then pivot to talk about the scale of the problem. How widespread was this, and just how many votes are we actually talking about here? Let's look at the numbers they present. And according to the sources, this wasn't just one or two precincts that forgot. They point to a state investigation that they say found this was a massive issue. We're talking 36 out of 37 early voting precincts in the county. That's nearly all of them that couldn't provide these signed tapes. So what does that actually mean when you translate it into votes? Well, the sources did the math. They claim that across all those precincts, you're looking at a huge number, roughly 315,000 early votes. And this is the exact batch of votes they say got counted without the proper required certification. Now this right here, this is the slide that brings their entire argument into sharp focus. This is where they make their big point. They take that number, 315,000 votes they say are in question, and they put it right next to the final presidential margin of victory in Georgia in 2020, which was tiny, just under 12,000 votes. For them, that comparison says it all. The number of votes with the alleged procedural issue dwarfs the margin of victory. That's the whole ballgame for their argument. But they don't just stop there. According to the sources, the issue with the tapes isn't a one-off problem. They see it as the cornerstone of a much bigger case, and they start pulling in other claims to suggest there's a wider pattern of problems. Let's take a look at what else they bring up. So they start stacking up other claims. They talk about CCTV footage that they allege shows ballots being scanned more than once. They bring up whistleblower affidavits describing pristine mail-in ballots with no folds. They cite reports about polling places staying open super late. And they raise questions about things like duplicate serial numbers on scanners and votes being counted without a corresponding ballot image. So you can see how they're trying to paint a much bigger picture here. So after laying out the rule violation, the huge number of votes, and all these other alleged issues, it all builds to their big finale. This is where they connect all the dots and draw their ultimate conclusion. And really, their core argument is pretty straightforward. It goes like this. If the law says you need a signature to certify a vote count, and those signatures are missing, then those votes were never properly certified. And if they're not certified, the sources argue, then they're illegitimate and shouldn't have been included in the final count. It's a very direct line of reasoning. And this is what they call the domino effect. It's the final piece of their puzzle. They argue that if you take their logic to its conclusion, if you actually disqualify those 315,000 votes in a race decided by less than 12,000, well, the math is simple.
the outcome in Georgia flips. That's the ultimate claim they're making.
So that brings us full circle, right back to the question we started with. The entire case, laid out in these sources, hinges on a procedural violation. And it leaves us with this fundamental question that's at the heart of the whole debate. When a mandatory election procedure isn't followed, what's supposed to happen? What is the correct legal remedy? And that really is the core of the issue they've presented.